Hello, students. So this is just a little brief history of digital publishing. This is brief, so I'm really glossing over some big elements of this. But in order to even understand digital publishing and what it came from, you have to understand what comes before it. And so we can sort of start actually long before the digital age, where we had scrolls. And scrolls, which you are familiar with, are these kinds of papers, and they're rolled up, and they're generally not written on both sides. They're only written on one side. And scrolls then about 2 millennia ago got replaced by codices, the codex. And a codex is what you think of when you think of a book that sort of opens and closes, on access, like with sewn together or glued together pages, like what we have here. We often use the word book for that, but in fact, the book is the information that's found inside it, and that's going to be important for anything that you would do in digital publishing, to understand the distinction between a book and a codex. Those are two different things. Codex is the physical object. The book is the information inside it. And one of the main things that sort of propels the codex forward is that Christianity was very interested in the codex. Christians were very early adopters of the codex. It has some ways in which it's superior. Obviously, you can write on both sides of the page, so that's very helpful. It also makes, essentially marking off a space easier since it's divided up. But of course, we begin to see differences in how one can use scrolls and how one can use codices. And, obviously there are things that you would think of like a footnote. You can have a footnote in a codex, but a footnote at the end of a scroll would be a very, very different thing altogether, right? And one way to just start to intuit the differences in the way that text has to be treated in a scroll or in a codex is simply think of the different ways in which a text is treated on a website that's just a kind of scrolling list of things, like certain kinds of social media feeds, versus one where it's page, 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 and how they can treat that differently. So we began to see, with the rise of the codex, a real difference in the way people thought about how text should be treated. Well, of course, I mentioned that it was adopted by early Christians, and that's important because Christians have this book called the Bible, and the Bible is very, very important to Christians. And so because of this, they created this huge infrastructure regarding literacy, the publication and production of Bibles. Now, of course, in the early Middle Ages, in the late classical era, early Middle Ages, it was not about whole Bibles because that was too difficult. It would normally be prayer books or smaller versions of this. And you have a lot of scribes. Some of them were in monasteries, sort of copying things, but others would have also been secular scribes who copied things for profit. Now, in both of those cases, you have to remember it takes a long, long time to copy a book. Any student who's ever just copied other student's notes can realize how long it takes to copy a book by hand. It would take a very, very long time. I remember there was a moment when I had to, for reasons that aren't worth getting into, I had to copy an entire book. And, it took weeks for me to do this. And every day my hand was sort of seized up like a claw from all the copying. It's a lot of hard work copying things, and it takes a long time. It's a lot of manpower. So what this meant was that books were expensive, not just because of the physical object of the codex, which was expensive, but not insanely expensive, but simply the amount of time it took to make one. You got to feed people. They've got to make their living while they're still doing that same thing. So you did have books. Books in codices, you had them being replicated, but it was expensive and time-consuming. Now, in the English-speaking world, so in the 1450s, you've got Johannes Gutenberg develops the printing press. And the first printing press comes to England, brought by a guy by the name of William Caxton in 1472. And someone who worked with him, a guy named Wynkyn de Worde, an actual name. It sounds like a children's book name of a publisher, but a real name. These two were working at the same time, and they had two very different strategies. Caxton did what we might consider more of prestige books, things which were more like the kinds of things you'd have in a codex, whereas Wynkyn de Worde was what we call a jobber. Just sort of, you want a bunch of cheap, relatively cheap, handbills or signs to put up, that he would do that in his. And it wasn't clear which one was going to win out. And over the long run, the Wynkyn de Worde model was the one that won out. Because, of course, the really important element of, or one really important element of the printing press was not just that you could print things faster, but that because they were faster, you could print things cheaper. I mean, the sheer value of the books that you see behind me, if you were to have those same books in the Middle Ages, would be staggering, before the printing press. And yet here, I, as someone who is of modest income, I'm an English professor, so I'm not rolling in the dough. I easily can buy a book without any trouble. And things sort of continued this way. Now Scrivener's continued on because, of course, something like a contract or an accounts book or something where there'd only be one or two copies of something, you still needed professionals to copy those. And that wasn't until the 19th century that you had the rise of a new technology, the typewriter. Now, of course, we still have the printing press after the typewriter, but the typewriter allows the creation of print of a single print copy of something. Of course, you could theoretically create a single print copy of something with a printing press, but it would not be a good use of your time. But a typewriter allowed you to type this up. And with the typewriter, there began to be this attitude that it was preferable to have something that looked like print, even if there was only a single document. And so you can already start to see how we still had the role for handwriting. A good example of this would be, if you get a letter in the mail, the letter will be typed up for clarity, but somehow the letter needs to be signed. Or a contract. You can't just put someone's contract. They have to sign and initial it in, using their hand. That somehow that act in our minds culturally validates that as being legitimate, where it wouldn't be otherwise. All right, so that sets the table to get into what we eventually had. All right, so I'm going to be using the word digital in this class, and obviously digital has a variety of meanings, right? But in this class, it's going to be any text that is displayed electronically. So whenever I use it, I mean any text that is displayed electronically. PDF is something which stands for portable document format. It was developed in the 1990s. It's a very specific kind of thing. So I find that often students, when they start studying these sorts of things, they equate PDF with other kinds of digital publishing. It's digital writing. It's in fact not at all. It tries to essentially replicate the feeling of a page. Whereas an ebook would be a publication that is intended to be viewed digitally, a kind of longer one. Now, this is distinct from a web page in that it's a type of content. So a web page may give access to various kinds of ebooks, but not vice versa. Now, an e-reader is a device that is designed primarily to display ebooks. Now, naturally, you can use a tablet that is intended for other purposes. You can download an e-reader. You can use your phone to read books. You can use a computer like the one I'm on now to read books. So when I say e-reader, really I mean a device that's designed primarily for that purpose. And then there's something that's called e-ink. Now, technically, e-ink is a brand, but we're going to use it more generally, as it often is. And this is a kind of electronic paper. it's not really paper. It's designed to look like a printed page without being backlit. So if you look at some kinds of e-readers, they're just like screens, right, where light comes out of them in the same way that most other screens do. But some of them, no light is coming off them, and instead it looks like a page. It's much softer looking, and they're designed to eliminate glare, because the assumption on that kind of e-reader is that you will be reading. Now, digitizing texts is relatively new compared to things like scrolls and codices, but it actually runs older in the internet age than you might think. Project Gutenberg, one of the most important and famous digitizers of text, that began using what's called plain text in 1971. So I was born in 1971, but I was still in diapers in 1971, to give you a sense of how long ago that was. So that was quite some time ago. Now, from the 1970s, 80s, and through most of the 90s, it was a project of limited, more of potential than of realized impact. And so in the late 1990s, you had many early attempts to market what we'd call e-readers, And it wasn't until 2006 when the Sony Reader became the first commercially successful e-reader. Now, that was not the first e-reader. That was the first commercially successful e-reader. But that was very quickly superseded by the Amazon Kindle in 2007. And the difference was the Amazon Kindle, because Amazon was a seller of books, they had easy access to the sales within the device. Those sold out on day one. So I remember very well being teaching that year, and how none of my students, I remember the Christmas very well. Before in the fall semester, none of my students had e-readers. They knew nothing of it. By spring, every one of my students had some kind of e-reader. Every mom and dad who had a child in college said, I better get them one of these e-readers. And they all came in with some form of e-reader or another all of a sudden. It was very sudden. And then the market was, they lost market share, or that's not fair to say. They lost market share, but the market was growing the whole time. And 2010, the Barnes & Noble Nook, which is in trouble dying today, but that came to dominate the market. And that was the dominant force until 2011, the next year. And then the iPad became the first commercially successful tablet. And the iPad, of course, as a tablet, could operate very easily as an e-reader as well. Now, other devices could as well, but a tablet just looks like an e-reader as well as these other things. Okay. Now, there are lots of ebook platforms, but just a few major ones would be HTML, kinds of things that your websites are normally written in. Plain text, which is the oldest form of text. And if you look on Gutenberg.org, Project Gutenberg, you'll see that a lot of I think everything they have is in plain text, as well as others, right? But their oldest stuff started off that way, very earliest language. Then you have PDF, which many of you are familiar with. It's designed to make it look like a page. We have, and then you have something called EPUB, which is open source, sort of, and that's what most ebooks in some way are based around. There's also iBook, which is Apple's proprietary version, which is based on EPUB. It's very, very close to it, but they need to have their own special one. And then there's Mobi, which is the Kindle one. Now, as a reader, the difference between an EPUB, iBook, and Mobi, you're not likely to be able to tell the difference. You have to get in the code behind there to see it. Well, what about, when you buy one, but what about when you buy a book, you're actually buying a license? Well, what happens when you borrow an ebook from a library? That's another thing to understand. Libraries buy licenses and that are good for 26 uses, and that 26 number doesn't come from nowhere. It has to do with an industry agreement, and there are really two main interconnected sources that they platforms that libraries use. One is called Overdrive, and another one is called Libby. So you will probably be hearing a lot about those. So those are the kind of the major terms and things you're going to be hearing this semester. Laying out what's happening today. I just want to give you a few major events. Obviously, this is a hugely complicated issue, but in 2002, Google began this kind of big project to try to digitize all or most of the world's books. And they scanned a decent number, 25 million books, which is a large number, but when you consider the number of books in the world, it is actually not a great percentage. But that ended up being mired in real serious legal battles with copyright holders, and it sort of has died away. It keeps trying to come back in some form or another, and depending on when you're watching this, maybe it is completely dead, or maybe it is has come back to life again in some way. In 2003, there's a science fiction author named Cory Doctorow who published his first novel. It's called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, under what's called a Creative Commons license. And on the first day, over 30,000 copies were downloaded, and we've had hundreds and hundreds of thousands every year since then. And Doctorow is one of these was a real pioneer in using these electronic formats to essentially get around traditional publishers and to reach his audience directly. We also had something in 2009, which we're seeing as I'm recording this today in early 2021, is becoming a live issue again, which was Amazon deleted, ironically, copies of the George Orwell book, the George Orwell book 1984 from users' devices, and that was because the one that they had was not the properly licensed one, and so they just sort of like deleted it. But of course, that was the moment, I think, when a lot of readers suddenly realized that just because you download a book doesn't mean you own it. You own the license to it. And the platform that has given it to you can take it away. This is becoming, as I'm recording this, as I said, in 2021, this is becoming a live issue again. But that is an important thing to understand when you're thinking about the way that people interact with all sorts of electronic publications. And then finally, in 2012, there was an antitrust case where there's 5 big publishers, traditional publishers in the world, and Apple was taken to court by the U.S. government under antitrust rules because of price fixing, and eventually they were forced to pay in 2016 about $450 million fine. So that was pretty serious. And so a lot of times when people say, like, well, why does an ebook cost this much? Or why does it work this way? Or why can I read it on this device or not that device? There's a lot of stuff going behind the scenes that they might not know about. So I hope this will give you the sort of just table setting, the basics, what is going on with ebooks that you can use for this class. And if you have no interest in the class I'm taking, those of you who are just sort of watching as Minions of Doom, I hope you have found this informative.